Welcome back to our Daniel study as we continue on this series, Made for This. And now we are on in the book of Daniel chapter 6, and it has been quite some time. In fact, when we first started in Daniel, he was a teenager, 14, 16 years old, but we know that around this time he's in his 80s now. And so he's actually served now his fourth king. And so we see this picture of just the permanence of this servant of God over the long haul. And when we see people like that, isn't it admirable when you see people that are faithful and consistent, not for the short term, but they're thinking and following God and learning about God still in their old age. And so when we think about this, how do they do it? How does this happen? Well, we see that the reason for this was his confidence in God. But he had to have courage as well. Courage to confront difficult situations and circumstances. And then you would think by 80, he had earned such a reputation that he had such a place where no one would bug him. But actually, as he was continuing to rise in power, even in his 80s, Darius, now the king of the Medo-Persians, establishes a form of government with 120 leaders all over the empire. And out of those, there are 3 who rule these and 1 who would rule those. And Daniel is that person that is to be placed in that incredible position and place of power, and the others are not happy about it. And so they conspire against him. They try to figure out, what can we think about? What can we devise? Or maybe he's doing something wrong and we'll figure it out and go to the king. Well, they couldn't figure it out, but they find out that the thing that they can exploit is his loyalty to God, his continual serving of the one true God. And so they devise a plan to say anybody who worships anyone else or prays to anything else will be thrown into the lion's den. And they lie to the king and they tell him, yeah, everyone agreed. And so he assumes that Daniel, whom he cared about, had also approved it. And it turns out that he hadn't. And the way the law works for Darius, even though he was the emperor, he had to follow the edict. It was not up to him. The form of government made it when something was sealed with that ring, it was law, and he had to do it and he had to follow through. And so Daniel goes up to the place where he stayed and he turned to Jerusalem, and it says that he went and he prayed as he had always done, as he had done before. And so this prayer thing, it wasn't because, oh no, I'm gonna face potential death, now I should pray. I love how that passage says, as he had always done. It was something that was a constant thing in his life. It is interesting that as the king finds out of this whole thing, he realizes he has to put Daniel in the lion's den. He is unable to sleep. It says that he stayed just thinking, looking through documents in his upper chamber, trying to see and figure out, how can I deliver Daniel? And he labored till sun went down to rescue him. And then it says, may your God who you serve continually deliver you. He's really just distressed. And he is unable to have rest. And Daniel moves on and moves forward with a courage that sometimes is hard to imagine. How do you face something like this, like death, and still stay true to God? And I have that question, and when I think about it, I hope there are people in your life that you can think through as you ask this question: how can we be faithful for the long haul? How can we be seen as servants of the living God? That could be the words that people say when we pass. Two people that have been that for me. One was our staff pastor, Pastor Jim Hilton, who served here at Northwood as an elder and was just a support and incredible influence to so many of us here at Northwood. He passed a few years ago, but one of the things that we were able to see is just his faithfulness, his constancy in the things of God, learning always till his very last moment, still seeking God's wisdom. And one time I sat down with him and I just did kind of like a little impromptu interview and just wanted to kind of hear, what are your practices of like spiritual life? Like I wanted to see kind of, how do you do this for the long haul? To be in ministry and to continue to be an influence and an impact. And he kind of didn't really answer it. He said, I don't really think that's the important thing. I think the most important thing is that you have a continual connection with God, whatever that is, whether it's in scripture, in prayer, in continue conversation, trusting Him, sharing Jesus with others in everything that I do, to be constant in that connection with God. Because oftentimes, and I think this is where he was going, we can create a checklist and we think like, if I just do this formula of checklist, then, you know, I've done my connection with God, and it can become superficial, and it can become something, a drudgery, something that doesn't really drive our intimacy with Him. My grandfather's another person, and a few weeks ago I had the opportunity to speak at a celebration of his 65 years of ministry. And that was, you know, I was like, what am I going to say? How do I honor my grandfather well? And so many people went on up and shared about these moments where he was just so impactful in their lives. And I went up there and I said, you know, there are many of those. But for me, when I think of my grandfather, thinking of one event or two, even three, it's about a whole lifestyle where he lived out a pattern of following Jesus in everyday life. It's a lifestyle of connection, of communing with God. And so when we think about how do we do this for the long haul, how did Daniel do it? It was that we need to have courage to not compromise, but that courage only comes with consistency. Consistency in the little, in the simple things. In his book, Atomic Habits by James Clear, he shares this important little principle, and this is a secular principle. This is not something in the Bible, but it's true because we see this in the Bible. And he talks about this principle of little things, little changes, but consistency, this 1% over a long time actually gives you exponentially different results. And so you can think of, if I change something now, how about a year from now? Will I see any difference? How about 10 years from now? How about 20 years from now? And what we have found is that simple, small little things can make a vast difference in our lives. And so the things that we think about that maybe are not so important are extremely important. In Romans 12:12, Paul reminds the Romans, rejoice in hope, be patient in tribulation, be constant in prayer. And so this consistency in our connection with God. We want to have a firm faith, right? We want to have that faith that Jesus talks about, that when the storms come, we're standing firm and not on sand, and we're on the rock, right? That is formed through continual communing and connection with God. And so the way that we think about how do we engage, how do we not compromise, how do we have courage, we're made for this. We just have to be constant in our communing, in our connection with God.